This is Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network. Welcome back to Hello Brain. I'm Collin Adams, and as always, I'm joined by Dr. Laura Davis, Dr. Dan O'Brien, and Dr. Ramona von Lieden. In today's episode, we're talking about distraction. So I don't know, maybe you guys know someone like this, but I don't know a single person who I've spoken with that says, I really wish that I was more distracted. We constantly have things flying at us all day long, whether it's notifications on phones, emails, texts, phone calls, stuff going on around us in our environment. And it seems like it would be nearly impossible to not be distracted at some level. So I don't think that the conversation today is about curing distraction. It's more of how can we begin to meet our brains in a way to better understand distraction and then maybe manage it a little bit better. Most of us would probably self-report without having a diagnosis that we can't focus or have something like ADHD. I hear this. ADHD has almost become like the butt of a joke in a lot of senses where people are like, oh yeah, I check my phone 800 times a minute. I have ADHD. And I'm like, well, no, not really. But it really is this whole idea of throughout the day, you think about going to look at your phone and then you like resurface 3 hours later and you're wondering what just happened to my entire evening. And it's the doom scroll. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with how often we choose distraction, but I'm just pulling these off the top of Google. The average person, and I think by the average person, I'm almost positive that when I did this search, it was just Americans. So really sorry to everybody else. Maybe you're less distracted. The average person checks their phone between 144 and 352 times per day, which if my poor math, because I don't have all of these advanced degrees like you guys, works out, is roughly 12 to 29 times per hour, which feels really low. And I don't know why that feels low, but nearly 50%, 57% of Americans consider themselves to be addicted to their phone or would report that they're addicted to their phone, which also feels insanely low. And then on average, also feeling low, people spend roughly 4.5 hours on their phones each day. There was actually a funny article that came out about this sports analyst that I follow who is considered like an insider. And so he's talking with agents, he's talking with teams, he's always getting the first scoop on everything. And his screen time per day is something like 17 hours. I mean, it's just sickening.
Oh my God.
That's part of his job. So last episode, we explored artificial intelligence. We talked about how these systems like AI agents can learn, adapt, and influence the way that we think and work. And we talked about some of the ways we're experiencing that, some of the things people can do to kind of combat that, to really approach learning separate from AI and use it more as a partner instead of as a do for me kind of a thing. Now, in this conversation, we're going to kind of turn the lens back onto us and ask a bit of a harder question as we integrate things like AI and tech advancements as a whole into our daily lives, whether it's scheduling our routines or using it to create our content for us. Do you guys think that we are unintentionally beginning to dysregulate our own brains?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but yeah, I do. I think the our phones are literally set up to multitask, right? We've got dozens of applications, we've got things going on at different times. And across the board, research, we know that multitasking doesn't actually work. We know that when people who are like, oh, I'm great at multitasking. You're not, you're just decent at doing several things at once, but no one's really good at multitasking. Um, so because we're all constantly kind of working below our capacity, since everybody's constantly got different browser tabs open, different things on their phone. Yeah, I do think it's creating a dysregulation and perhaps encouraging more distraction.
Yeah, no, I think Ramona, you make a great point, and I think when we look at just this failure of focus, we have to think that this could be more of kind of an emotional escape mechanism rather than kind of a failure of focus. So I think when we look at things, a lot of people ask, well, Dr. O'Brien, like, what can we do about that? It could be optimizing your environment. I'm a big thing of proactive, or practicing mindfulness. I think being very proactive with that is really key. It slows everything down. You're able to have that a little bit more focus, which I think that mindfulness is really good. And then just being able to prioritize various tasks as well, and just in certain important life areas. So I think that it can be, like I said in the beginning, just more of an emotional escape mechanism rather than just a failure of focus. So I think something to look at too could be very important.
And I think it's just about like creating boundaries. Like if we intentionally create boundaries, then, we won't have as much of that dysregulation, but we have to create those intentionally.
Yeah, agreed, Laura. I think though, what's challenging is that the way, the manufacturers of our phones and the manufacturers of these applications are intentionally trying to create quick hits of reward, right? It's the quick dopamine hit that you're responding to. So people struggle with creating those boundaries because they're getting something, the feedback from it.
I was sick for entire week last week and like I didn't look at social media, like I didn't miss it at all. We're just this is just what we do now, but like then you like and to be honest, I haven't looked at it today either and like I'm not really sick anymore. Like so I think it's just these are patterns that are rehearsed and like you're used to looking at your phone so you do and now like I haven't done it for a week and like I didn't really like I don't really care. I don't miss it. So it's just again, it's like the things that you keep doing that become patterns, then you can also get
Yeah,
patterns.
that's interesting, Laura. I think habits are, I mean, yeah, habits become what they are, but a lot of times we think that we're going to miss it more than we do. I wanted a trip a few years back to Cuba, where like Cuba, if you have an American cell phone, you have American, like you can't use those in Cuba. They don't, because of course we were really super welcome in Cuba and, blocked Cuba for a long time. And so all I used my phone for was I downloaded a map of Cuba, so that was my map, and that was the only thing I used my phone for. I had no internet. I had no, I couldn't make a phone call. It was great. I honestly didn't feel like I was missing out on anything. Like I was like being present in the world. And then you come back and you're like, it was honestly pretty overwhelming when I came back to America. And it was like you're hit with all the notifications, the messages, and I was like, oh my god, I didn't deal with this for a week, and it was so nice.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think the fact that even with our phones, right, we know that novelty triggers kind of this immediate like dopamine spikes, right, which activates the brain's reward system, particularly in the midbrain, the nucleus accumbens, right, which encourages more exploration and more learning. So I think it's just kind of that natural mechanism of that dopamine. You're right, just kind of that reward pathway that the novelty that's able to trigger that, and we want to learn more and more and more. And the big thing, it's almost like that cycle of addiction, right? How do we interrupt that, right? We know that reward pathway and that cycle of addiction continues to go through. The key is how do we interrupt that? How do we interrupt this, right? This dopamine spike. What are some of the solutions that we need to be able to look at? Because I think that'd be really key as we look at the future of science, the future of medicine, is just that interruption of that cycle. And I think that dopamine release goes a lot with the addiction sciences, which I still think is a huge problem right now in society.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Collin. I have a question to throw back your way because as someone who, you speak about this pretty openly that you've dealt with ADHD and you think about it a lot, is from what the research shows, which with the drugs that are out there to treat ADHD or to help you function at a higher level, it's usually because people who have ADHD, their brains don't respond as quote normally or as robustly to reward, right? You have a lowered reward threat, or I should say you have a higher reward threshold, than that it's harder to get that dopamine hit, it's harder to get that reward. Do you think, one, that the ADHD meds that kind of help to release that dopamine earlier actually work? Do you think they're effective? Or two, do you think that that really is why you find distraction to be such what it is that you're just not getting the same amount of reward from doing a task that maybe someone who doesn't have ADHD does?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll keep my answer on the simple side because I could probably talk for the next 3 hours just about everything you just asked. But the with medication, I think that, and I actually just did a recording on this for our Brain Innovation Network digital platform where we're talking about things like ADHD. It's medication often gets seen as like evil, or it gets weaponized a lot, or parents with kids that are young who are expressing symptoms of ADHD or are given a diagnosis are very often like yeah, I don't touch me with the medication, like don't touch my child with the medication. And I can totally understand that. Um, I got started with medication. I started on probably a bit too strong of a dosage. And so I didn't have a great interaction with it at first, but then I corrected the dosage with my doctor, who was great, and was able to have a better outcome. And I think just with medication, the big thing is to remember that it's a tool to help someone learn behaviors. As far as it relates to dopamine, the ADHD brain, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head, I can't think of the specific like process for how dopamine is created in the brain. There's things like norepinephrine and epinephrine that lead to this, that lead to this. Um, when I do a genetics report, my brain does not at all create norepinephrine, which is, I think, a lead up to dopamine. And so it's not just that it's harder, it's just my brain doesn't do it. It won't. And unless I behavior modify myself into dopamine. But dopamine is such an interesting topic in and of itself because we talk about this dopamine button, and every time we check our phone, dopamine. Every time, like right now, there's some random phone number calling my phone, and I should probably flip my phone over because you see someone calling you and it's like dopamine, brain residue left over there. And the more and more and more and more we press that button for anyone, whether it's a healthy brain, an ADHD brain, or anything in between, that that button gets heavier to press down. You need more reward to get the same amount of dopamine and more reward. That's why you can see things like addictive behaviors begin to spiral out of control because they've pressed this button so many times and so deeply that to get the same reward out of whatever behavior that is, it needs to be like significantly more exciting or engaging or whatever it might be. So yeah, great question. But medication can be really helpful to kind of keep everything in line so that the behaviors can be formed.
I love that approach to it of it being like, I mean, that's what, yes, you're supposed to be using medications like that for, is to help you create new habits, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a support system. So, as we talk about the difference between distraction and attention, I think those two words pair really well together because distraction is like a very momentary thing. And like when my phone rang, I got distracted for a second. I went like this, like physically. Attention is a very momentary thing. Like I am in this moment paying attention to this conversation. Concentration would then be like my ability to sustain that attention over time. So, Laura, as we kind of talk about attention from a neurological standpoint, you talked about things like what we feed to our brain is what's going to be most important for developing that ability to pay attention. Can you maybe touch on that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, attention is like it's like a network of things, right? You have parts of the brain, like we talked about, the prefrontal cortex is involved in like planning and decision making. And then you have other regions that help with like directing attention in space. And then you have other regions that kind of like filter incoming information. So, like collectively, it's just really the brain's ability to like prioritize what matters in a moment and then not prioritize what doesn't matter. Um, and that can be hard, especially in our world of distractions. So, it's kind of like energy allocation, like where do we want to put, where's the brain's deciding to put this energy? And then, when you have even a healthy brain without ADHD, there's so many distractions. Like if someone called me, I'd also look at my phone and I am not diagnosed with ADHD. We saw you look at your phone and then like you came back to the conversation, but of course it takes that moment away because something lights up. So, um, yeah, but attention is just, you got to prioritize what's important in the moment.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'll just speak from the perspective of the ADHD brain. I learned this in one of the brain health certification programs I was going through several years ago. They were measuring the ADHD brain during a task with EEG sensors, and what would normally happen in a normal healthy brain when someone applies attention to a task to get it done is that the frontal lobe or like the executive center is really going to start to fire, and a lot of these things like dopamine and endorphins and all these things will start to be created in the brain to then produce the attention. In the ADHD brain, what I've seen and learned is fascinating is in many cases when effort is applied to a task that there's no interest in, the brain does not fire up. It actually shuts down. So when you get things like that 1,000-yard stare from an ADHD person, and I can relate to this because like I love sports. And if you put some kind of article or stats or something like that in front of me, like I can feel my brain is really engaged and I am enjoying it. I'm loving intaking the information. But then you put like eighth grade history in front of eighth grade me, and I was just like staring at the content because I had no interest in it. And so that's one of the big features of the ADHD brain is the interest versus non-interest. There's a significant.
Well, this makes a lot of sense because my boyfriend has ADHD. My boyfriend has ADHD, and so I just the other day was telling him a story, and I thought it was kind of important. Clearly, he wasn't interested because he listened to the end of the story, and then he said, "Okay, yeah. So at work today, we did he's a firefighter. He was like, we did obstacle course with the fire." And I was like, were you even listening?" But hopefully, I can tell him that it was just his ADHD.
And what's really interesting, right?
Make it make sense.
Oh my gosh. No, you're right. Because I think with the ADHD brain, right, this functions with lower dopamine levels, lower norepinephrine levels, and that's what affects a lot of the executive decisioning, the function, the motivation, the intention regulation. So I think that it's this hyper intense, Laura, maybe that you're talking about, focus, high creativity, maybe impulsivity that you see a lot with the ADHD kids. Well, ADHD adults
And adults.
too.
Yeah.
And adults, of course, which is becoming a huge topic.
The firefighter job is a great one for him though. Like I was going down that path for a bit, and
Yep.
it's exciting. Everything's new every day. There's like moment to moment changes. Great fit for an ADHD brain.
Well, I will say he's in luckily, a slower fire station. So and so I actually think that that is a struggle for him, even because he's been telling me recently that like he doesn't feel challenged at work, and then it only takes one. I'm very happy with him not getting calls, but so that's interesting because I think he doesn't feel like he's getting enough of that, and it's a little more recliner than fighting fires. So like
Fair.
he needs that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, Collin, based on your sports passion, you see a lot of ADHD kids play soccer and hockey, right? And you being a big baseball guy, it's interesting, right? I think with the baseball, you see a lot of the soccer players, the hockey, the ball, the hockey puck's constantly moving. You're constantly just, changing direction, which I always thought being a sports fan too, Collin, was pretty interesting. And you being a baseball guy.
Yeah. It's, the relationship between baseball and distraction is well known. I mean, you have to be a certain level of weird as a person to play baseball because there's so much downtime, which I think from an ADHD perspective really was good for me because I could just goof around and be creative and joke in the dugout in between innings when I wasn't pitching or wasn't playing in the game. So that's a good fit. But then in basketball, when I was playing that, it's like super engaging. But then we get in a timeout and my coach is like, "Hey, woohoo, like, are you here with us or are you somewhere else?" And so it's interesting how baseball is very like sustained boring for a long time. And then basketball is like bam, and then nothing. And to watch how my ADHD brain responded in those two environments, I was much more steady in baseball, and then basketball because it's like fire action and then you're sitting on the bench. It was interesting to see how my attention span really was changed in those two environments. But
Do you think also, Collin, I think, I mean, not to say this for all sports, there's definitely an element of like you're constantly having to think about, analyze the field, analyze what's going to happen next. I mean, obviously, football, we love to try to look at what play you might run. But in baseball, as you spoke to, because I played softball in college, like I'm, one of those weirdos who found it engaging enough. But part of it was that like when you are waiting between pitches in your mind, you have to be constantly like, okay, if it goes here, where am I throwing the ball? If it goes here, where am I going? Like what, there's a lot of mental game that never stops in baseball, despite the fact that you're not moving.
Right. Yeah. And I think as a pitcher, that was a little bit easier because I really was in control of the pace of the game for the most part. And my pitch to pitch decision making was very much based on pitch sequence and all of that stuff, versus if you're standing in left field and the ball hasn't come to you in 3 innings, you're kind of starting to pick grass and dance around and look in the stands and do all those things. So it can be a lot harder position by position. And even, as a hitter, ADHD or distraction, just like your ability to process information quickly because the ball's coming fast, and it's changing direction, it's moving around. And so, being able to stay on task as a hitter is really hard too. So when we're looking at things like Instagram feeds and scrolling through TikTok and we're constantly getting this novelty switching, what's happening, Dr. Dan, neurologically when we're doing those things?
Yes, this is where the novelty triggers immediate dopamine spikes by activating the brain's reward system, right? And that's where you continuously have these rewards that really encourages exploration as well as learning. It could be from a good aspect or a negative aspect. But again, it's that we just talked about, that dopamine spike, that reward pathway, that's really enhancing that cognitive flexibility in that regard.
And then, Ramona, as when we're even talking how I got that phone call during this conversation, when we're constantly exposed to notifications, how does that influence the brain's ability to pay attention, but also our stress response?
Yeah, actually, dopamine's a big modulator for the stress response. And so when you see it, especially now, this can kind of take it from both aspects of, we spoke about seeing more ADHD in adults, and I think we're pretty aware that like chronic stress in people is a huge issue. Chronic stress actually has a huge impact on our ability to produce dopamine, right? So maybe part of the reason why we're seeing these increasing numbers in adults is that we're actually seeing the sort of effects of chronic stress, like us not being able to get that same reward response that we normally would. But my, opinion on sort of the flip side of like, how does the distraction impact our stress response? I mean, let's think about this even, from your own experience of it. When we get constant notifications, it becomes habitual and we start to feel that as being normal. And then when you don't get them, you have a stress response because it feels abnormal, right? Like, have you ever had one of those days where you're like, wow, I haven't gotten an email today? And like, even if you're happy about it, like part of you is like, that's weird. Like this feels strange. This feels unusual. Which triggers a little bit of a stress response, because it's unusual. It's out of the ordinary. So there's this constant back and forth of like this again, this multitasking environment that we are constantly put through that creates a stress response. And then over time, that chronic stress response decreases our dopamine output. And you're seeing this big feedback loop that's leading to it
Yeah.
just being a lot harder to stay focused.
Yeah, and I would add to that and say, if you've ever, I've tried to practice boredom, which sounds weird, but to just disconnect from everything, because like you just said, you go through a period of time where maybe you're firing away emails, you're getting them in response, you're getting texts, phone calls, messages on social media, and you're in meetings all day, and then all of a sudden all of that stops. It's just this uncomfortable external and also internal silence that a lot of people self-report as loneliness, because they're constantly pressing that dopamine button and they're constantly engaged in conversation with someone or something.
Yep.
And then to stop that, it's like slamming on the brakes of your car, where you're like, all of a sudden you're just alone with yourself. And because we don't spend any time in that state, many people don't even know how to handle it. And so that's when things like pleasure seeking or attention seeking or dopamine seeking behaviors can happen, because we're not used to and we're uncomfortable with the ability to just be still and be with ourselves and be quiet and be focused just in the present moment. So I
Do you,
want,
Colin, do you think that we spoke in a previous episode, we talked a lot about kids and education and how they're learning and how when kids go to school, right, you're constantly surrounded by other humans. You're going through all of these different topics every day. And there's a lot of benefits to the constantly being surrounded by humans. That's how you learn social interaction, which is very important. But on the flip side, that also leads to kind of that like this expectation that like that is always your reality. I have a friend who's starting he does virtual reality mindfulness app, and he's trying to get this into schools with the idea that like again, how do we teach younger generations how to sit with themselves, how to interpret the world in a way that allows them that space to be quiet and be alone for a moment. And it can be as simple as going out for a walk, but for a lot of people, because they don't have access to it or that's not something they're used to doing, it's not a habit they have, right? If they go for a walk, they're on their phone, that it's not really serving the purpose. So it's an interesting question of like how do we start to institute those habits in a way that people are actually going to make that change and be comfortable with being alone and be comfortable with the boredom.
it's very hard. I mean, it honestly just takes discipline. I think it's not something that you can necessarily biohack into yourself. It's just like we've talked about, like a repeated pattern where you're choosing something different. You people just like the thought that comes to mind for me when I'm like walking around here in San Francisco and you know, nice day, people are out is, majority of people are even crossing the road without looking up and they're just scrolling on their phone. And, fortunately nothing happens, but like I feel this like element of sadness when I see that because they're not engaged with the world. They're engaged with this form of the world that they've kind of become more associated and more comfortable with. And this happens when people are driving. Like, wow, can you imagine how much time would be saved if people went when the light was green instead of looking at their phone? I'll just leave that comment there, but
Yeah.
it's
Well,
it's
also, Colin, like 20 years ago, people didn't have a phone to look at while they were driving, right? And people still managed to get where they were going. Like we don't
right.
these it's the perfect example of like the absolute addiction that we've all created. Like you mentioned at the very beginning of the episode this the percentage of people that self-report addiction to their phones feeling low. 100%. Most people aren't self-reporting it, but ask them what they do when they're in the car. Is their hand on their phone? I bet you it is. Always, right?
Yeah.
I met someone here in Texas who in Texas it's not, if you're stopped at a stoplight, it's not illegal to be on your phone. It's right, you're not supposed to when you're actually driving, but when you're stopped, you're allowed. And I met this lawyer who like he was the reason, he was the guy who got that pass and he was all proud of it. And I was like, that's not helping anything. That's making this problem worse.
Exactly. Yeah, like
Like
you're
don't
giving.
encourage it.
Yeah. And so I wonder because you brought up the idea of 20 years ago people didn't have access to this stuff. And there have been a lot of things where whether it's ADHD or even in sports like clubhouse related issues with players like Philadelphia Eagles players, that I'm wondering if this stuff is new or if like distraction is actually increasing or if we're becoming, Laura, maybe just more aware of it.
I mean, I definitely think it's increasing. Like we said, there wasn't social media to the degree that it is now 15 years ago. I don't even know when it started. So I think I think it's definitely distractions are increasing for sure. And I think we're choosing to pay more attention to it.
We talk about sort of the loneliness side of this, and with especially with social media where we have access to seeing what other people are doing in their lives throughout their days, right? If you ask somebody what they're doing doom scrolling, probably a lot of people are going to say Instagram, right? And they're looking at stories and they're looking at posts, because we talked in a couple of our episodes about the desire for human connection. And a lot of us are, I mean, look, we're all right now sitting in our respective offices, right, on our computers talking to each other. But many of us, like I work remotely, you might not spend that much time with humans throughout your day anymore. And so I think a lot of us are using our phones and we're using social media to fill that gap in human connection. And it's becoming a distraction because we aren't satisfying it in our real lives.
In regards to the dopamine, right? We know it's a neurotransmitter, reward, motivation. You have the acute stress, which kind of causes that initial increase in dopamine, and that kind of helps
Right.
facilitate coping. So you wonder again with this ability that this will help us facilitate coping with our phones, the fact that again, we continue to kind of go back to that reward pathway. And what's interesting too, and that's the acute stress that shows that increase in dopamine. But for chronic stress, research has shown that leads to depletion of dopamine. So it's really interesting now. And then we take that and now look at that with the various diseases that dopamine is affiliated with. And how can we kind of match all this up, what we're saying? And is that causing a certain amount of diseases that are kind of out there that are affected with dopamine, right? We know dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and the diseases associated with different neurotransmitters could be really fascinating, right? We know different diseases right now are on the rise, and could all this really be connected? It would be interesting. It would be interesting to see. I think it really comes down again to that dopamine. It comes down to that reward pathway, and we keep seeking more and more rewards. We keep going back to our phones, and it's just how do we interrupt that cycle of almost of addiction with our phones?
Dr. Dan, it's almost like you're inside my head, because what I was just going to say is that people go through their entire stressful work days, whether it's designing or producing or coding or whatever it might be. And then what do they do when they get home? They plop down on the couch and they just scroll. And often what people report with that is that, oh, I'm just trying to like check out and like maybe disassociate from reality for a while to just like relax. But by doing this, you're just feeding that loop even more. So it's not
Ramping up.
actually relaxing. It's
Right.
engaging your brain further and further and further. And we're seeing more and more reports of things like burnout and executive dysfunction, stress overload. People aren't sleeping. And it's because we're coping with stress by stressing our brains even more by scrolling down social feeds or whatever it might be. So I'm curious to hear all of your perspectives. And Laura, I'll start with you with all of this digital distraction. How do we actually differentiate between something that's digital distraction, like maybe checking my phone a few too many times in an hour, versus ADHD related executive dysfunction? So an actual diagnosis, or some of these neurological diseases that Dr. Dan has brought up, and stress overload and sleep deprivation. How do we really see, or how do we notice maybe the difference between something that's just simply distraction and something that could actually be like a diagnosis forming?
I think you have to think about what it's based in. So like digital distraction is based in like the environment. So if like the phone or whatever is removed, then like or boundaries are set, right? Then you can function as normal. I think with ADHD, it's more like trait based. So even when a distraction is removed, like those behaviors are still going to exist in someone with ADHD. And then when you have like stress overload and you're not sleeping, once that is restored, like normal function should restore too. So I think it's really based on like, is it environmental based? Is it trait based? Is it, state based? So I think you have to put it into categories a little bit.
Yeah, and I would say that people can probably begin to notice if something is state based or trait based when they take a break from overexposure to stuff like these digital tools. Dr. Dan, what are you seeing? Maybe from like a dopamine depletion versus chasing perspective.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think if you have that dopamine depletion, right, you're kind of slowing down. You're in that chronic stress phase. And I think what's interesting too, Colin, that we haven't really talked about much is again, if you have that stress, now you have elevated cortisol levels. And we know there's different diseases associated with cortisol. And I think more and more people now are trying to get their cortisol levels checked because now you have that high. Cortisol is a stress hormone, right? And I think when that's at an all-time high, I think that's what's triggering some of these diseases along with the dopamine depletion, maybe even overactivation. But I think looking again at this cortisol level, as we're talking about, different biomarkers and neurotransmitters, this could be a certain fascinating topic in science. And it's been researched among many companies as they're looking at cortisol. Now even seeing cortisol levels be related to elevated blood sugar and diabetes. If you have elevated cortisol, now that's leading to more diabetes. We know if we have 300 million Americans in the country, about 10%, about 30 million have diabetes. And I'd be curious how much that's contributed to elevated cortisol levels as the stressor, right? And how do we, how do we reduce the stress? How do we kind of down regulate the sympathetic nervous system, which I think is really key. We talked about in the previous episode. So lots of really cool things, I think, in the science as we look at driving the science, as we look at the future, especially of these reward transmitters, neurotransmitters like dopamine, but also count, I think cortisol is a fascinating topic.
I would love to bounce off of your cortisol note, Dr. Dan, because I think something that we know about, again, about humans by nature, the capacities that we have to relieve stress largely are physical. And a lot of this, again, prior to Western society, prior to all this, if you had stress, it was usually something that was physical. Maybe it was an animal in the wild, maybe it was a lack of food and a lack of resources. And so now all of our stressors, by and large, are digital. It's work. It's having too many things to do, over scheduling, making sure that your kids are taken care of. But all of these things largely revolve around the schedule on our phones, what's going on our computers, answering emails, right? All of these algorithms and pingings that are like, you have to get to this, you have to answer this. And this builds up that chronic stress response in your body. And we don't really have an effective outlet for it. I mean, physical exercise is a big one. Most across the board, you can say that, and it can be as simple as going for a walk. It doesn't have to be lifting heavy like Laura does, but that is the easiest way for our body to relieve that stress response. But that's not necessarily something that's an option for a lot of people, and I think that's also contributing to this increasing distraction, is that we don't have anywhere to put all of that cortisol. We don't have somewhere to relieve that pressure, relieve that stress, and then it turns back into that cycle of like, okay, well, I feel like I'm taking a break, but really you're just distracting yourself further.
And I think that's where the mindfulness, that's where the meditation, that's how we slow down, create that sense of peace, slow down our sympathetic nervous system. Because we know, again, if you have an overactive nervous system, sympathetic, right? Increased heart rate, blood pressure, everything elevates. So it's practicing, I think, this mindfulness that Ramona, you and I have talked about in previous episodes, as if that would be through yoga and through meditation, just to slow things down, I think could be a really good solution to maybe reducing your cortisol levels. That shows a reduction in diabetes levels. And again, it down regulates that nervous system. And I think there's been more research, and I think more people are engaging besides just walking, doing weight training, but they're engaging more in yoga, meditation, to have that sense of peace, to reduce in that balance, right? To reduce the stress levels.
Yeah. Or even just, I say it all the time, but like for me, it's just go outside and like connect with the world around you, right? We have it. It's free. It's right outside the door. It's spending time in the sun. It's spending time around nature. It's, just even sitting outside just can be such a huge, huge help to this.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
The next time you take Pete for a walk, you can't be talking to your girl on Duolingo.
I know.
Now,
Trust me,
going to
I thought
an
about
Eagles
this.
game would elevate my stress a bit, I think, compared to a Chiefs game.
Oh, because they would beat the Chiefs.
Yeah, that would create a lot of stress. That would overactivate my sympathetic nervous system more.
You know what the one non-stressful Eagles game I've ever watched in my entire life was?
The Super Bowl
I
last
know.
year?
The last Super Bowl. Yeah, the last Super Bowl we won.
You always bring that
biggest
up.
stressful Eagles game I've ever seen.
Mahomes is getting his knee back, and
Sorry, I had to.
I think Mahomes,
Okay.
Kelsey comes back. I think the Chiefs. We have Big Red. Reed comes back. I think we'll be in good shape.
This took a turn quickly.
Yeah,
It's okay. I think the cortisol, Dr. Dan, bringing that up, people, this is chronic, chronic and epidemic levels. People report that they lay their head down on the pillow at night and immediately their brain starts racing, and they have all of these incredible ideas. Maybe they're giving world-bending speeches in their mind. They're resolving a lot of the world's issues. They're overcoming a lot of the work issues that they're dealing with, but they're supposed to be sleeping, or they're falling asleep fast because they're exhausted, but then they wake up at like 2 o'clock in the morning and sit awake for 3 or 4 hours. And when I was working as a functional medicine health coach, I think this is something I saw a lot. And when I would ask someone about the pattern of their day, they would say, well, I wake up to an alarm and then, have emails piling through immediately. And I got to rush through my breakfast and then hurry off, get the kids off to school and then get to work real quick. And then, it's just like chaos, meeting after meeting, or I'm seeing patient after patient after patient, and I'm solving all these issues and I'm dealing with these things. And then if I have a chance for lunch, that's great. But it's typically I'm like eating while I'm working. And then, I continue through the rest of my day, and it's push, 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 push. And I'm being productive. I'm getting things done. I'm in meetings. I'm having work loaded onto me. I'm having all these notifications come through on my phone. I don't know why I can't sleep. And I'm like, did you just hear yourself? You trained yourself all day long to not be able to sleep. And people just, with something like sleep deprivation or even distraction, the topic of this episode, people expect things like sleep and attention to just happen because they should. You don't have a player like Michael Jordan just expect to score 45 points in an NBA Finals game. There's a ton of work that goes into that. Or you don't just expect for you to pass an exam. You study for it, you learn the material, and then you go and you're prepared. For some reason in society, we have just begun to expect these things like sleep and attention and focus and emotional control to happen because they should, when they're also trained, learned skills, trained things that have to be formed in the brain through neuroplasticity, through rewiring, through repeated effort. And something, even as an applicable note that someone can do that's so easy to improve their sleep or improve their focus is just segment how you approach your day. So it's not wake up to an alarm and instant into emails. It's wake up to an alarm, take 3 deep breaths, and then maybe go to your emails, and then take 3 more deep breaths, and segment rest into the cycle of constant stress. Because if you're just like the example I just gave, alarm, emails, kids to school, fast breakfast, fast lunch, work. At 9 p.m. or 10 p.m., you're up here in a nervous system sense, stress sense. Sleep happens like way down here, at least quality sleep, not exhaustive sleep. And so the difference is, instead of being up here, if you segment in recovery breaks or meditation or mindfulness or going outside and experiencing nature or whatever it might be, you're starting to see this happen. Just in the same way that an athlete would tailor his approach to a week prepping for a game, you're seeing this flow begin to happen throughout a day where you're training yourself to be maybe here when it's time to sleep, or level when it's time to focus and not be distracted, rather than giving yourself one level of feedback, which the brain takes. The brain isn't going to decide what it's neuroplastic about. It's just going to take what you give it and form those connections, regardless of what that is, whether it's good or bad. And so the more segmenting we can do, the more, funneling between rest and stress and things like focus and distraction that we can do, the better the outcome is going to be.
Yeah, you make a great point, Colin, because I think that cortisol, it follows this 24-hour circadian rhythm. So essentially around midnight, cortisol should be at your lowest point. But to your point, it's at your highest point. And usually in the morning, the first thing that goes up right is your cortisol. Most heart attacks happen early morning because your cortisol levels are so high. So you're right. I think finding ways to, downregulate that nervous system, keep our cortisol levels high, keep them more regulated throughout the day, just like our blood pressure, right? That's usually the most accurate times in the morning to get that check. That fluctuates again throughout the day, just like our cortisol levels. So really fascinating point, Colin.
As we kind of come to a close on this conversation about distraction, we want to start to see attention versus distraction as one of our most precious or valuable cognitive currencies. Like, how can we align our attention to the things that we know matter, whether we're paying attention to being mindful or paying attention to the present moment, being with our families, being present with our coworkers, being present with Mr. Peter, whatever it might be. What is one little experiment that our listeners could do this week to maybe start to move in the direction of treating attention like a currency?
Try one day with no social media.
Love that. Yeah. I mean, even in a smaller space, it's just do something without anything else going on. Like a lot of people like to work with music in the background, work without it. Maybe you put the TV on while you're cooking, turn the TV off. Like one piece, just make it so whatever you're doing is the only thing going on.
Single task.
Yeah, and I think having that mindfulness, that's my perspective, that mindfulness, yeah, turn the TV off, walk outside, practice that piece, right? Practice that slowing down, think about that down regulation of the nervous system and how we can down regulate that even more over the next week.
Yeah. And I mean, again, we're talking about how do you create small habits? Start small, like do one thing different and then see how it felt, right? As Laura pointed out, over the last week, she was sick and she maybe didn't intentionally stop going on social media or stop going on her phone, but she just didn't. And she was like, oh, that was actually kind of nice. Maybe we should keep doing that.
Yeah. And I'll just say I said this in episode 1 of Hello Brain. It's this idea of just paying attention. Be mindful of where your attention is going. Be mindful of what you're doing and what choices you're making throughout the day. And really starting there can make all the difference. All right. This has been Hello Brain. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network.